A racist woman demanded a black man be kicked off the plane, but when he stood up and said just 5 words, everyone froze. What happened next will shock you and restore your faith in people. Stay with me till the end, and if powerful, real-life stories move you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss one. It was a busy, humid Friday afternoon at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, and the terminal buzzed with the kind of pre-flight energy that only comes from hundreds of people moving with a purpose, rushing to make connections, grabbing overpriced snacks, searching for charging stations, and keeping one eye on the departure boards that blinked with gate changes and boarding calls. Among the steady stream of travelers was Jordan Miles, a quiet, thoughtful man in his mid-30s, who walked with the calm air of someone used to chaos but never consumed by it. He wore a navy blue hoodie with the sleeves gently pushed up to his elbows, a pair of well-worn jeans, and a simple black backpack slung over one shoulder. The kind of person you might glance at once and forget. Not because he lacked presence, but because he didn't demand attention. Jordan wasn't flashy or loud, didn't wear a suit or carry a leather briefcase, and certainly didn't look like someone who'd make headlines. He was a school counselor in a small Texas town, the kind of man who spent his days listening more than speaking, helping kids find their voice, especially the ones who felt invisible. This trip wasn't for business or pleasure. It was personal. His younger brother, Marcus, was finally opening his first restaurant in Atlanta after years of hard work, and Jordan, ever the supportive older sibling, was flying out to be there for the grand opening, proud and excited in a quiet, grounded way. After clearing security and grabbing a bottle of water, Jordan arrived at his gate early, as he always did, preferring to avoid last-minute stress. He sat near the window, watching planes taxi in and out, reading a book he had brought along, something about resilience and empathy, topics close to his heart. When boarding was finally announced, he stood, waited his turn patiently, and made his way down the jet bridge without fuss. Once on board, he greeted the flight attendant with a warm smile, located his seat near the middle of the cabin, a window seat, which he always preferred, and stowed his bag neatly under the seat in front of him. He pulled out his book again, adjusted his posture, and allowed himself a brief moment of peace. Eyes scanning the pages, mind slowly shifting from the chaos of the airport to the quiet joy of anticipation. The cabin was slowly filling with passengers, the usual hum of voices, overhead bins clicking shut, parents wrangling kids, and the occasional sound of someone struggling with luggage. Jordan barely noticed the noise. He was immersed in his book, and content to stay unnoticed, just another passenger on a crowded flight. That would have remained the case. Just another ordinary flight. Just another peaceful moment in a long week. If not for the woman who appeared in the aisle beside him, glancing at the seat number on her boarding pass, and then freezing in place the second her eyes landed on Jordan. She was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, wearing an expensive-looking beige jacket, oversized sunglasses that didn't quite hide the sharpness of her eyes, and holding a designer handbag in one hand and a large tote in the other. Her lips pursed, immediately, and her body language shifted into something noticeably colder. She looked down at Jordan as though she'd just found something she didn't like and was deciding what to do about it. He looked up, gave a polite smile, and nodded slightly, assuming she was his seatmate, and that the awkwardness was simply the usual shuffle of strangers being crammed into tight spaces. But she didn't smile back. Instead, without sitting down, she turned around in the cramped aisle and waved over a nearby flight attendant, pointing with a deliberate motion toward Jordan's row. Jordan watched, puzzled, as the woman leaned in and whispered something to the flight attendant. Whatever she said made the attendant's eyes widen slightly in surprise, and Jordan could hear fragments of the exchange. "I don't feel comfortable, and... is there another seat available?" Just loud enough to catch the edge of her words, just sharp enough to make his chest tighten. He closed his book slowly, not because he was angry, but because something about the moment felt heavier than it should have. Around them, other passengers were beginning to notice the tension. The aisle grew a little quieter. A few people looked up from their phones. Jordan didn't move. He simply sat there, still and silent, as the woman gestured toward him again, and added in a voice now louder and full of entitlement, "I just don't think it's appropriate." Her tone had changed. It wasn't confusion or discomfort anymore. It was judgment. It was accusation wrapped in politeness, the kind that made people like Jordan invisible and dangerous at the same time. And in that moment, he realized something that made his heart sink, not because it surprised him, but because it didn't. She hadn't looked at his seat number and objected to being in the middle. She hadn't asked to move because she wanted more legroom. She had seen him, a black man sitting quietly in a window seat, and decided she didn't belong next to that. No explanation needed. No reason given. Just the assumption that her comfort, her presence, was more valid than his. The flight attendant, clearly caught off guard and trying to maintain professionalism, gently explained that the flight was nearly full, that it would be difficult to move anyone at this stage. But the woman insisted, her voice rising just enough to catch the ears of more passengers. "I paid for this seat," she said. "I have the right to feel safe." Safe. That word, the way she said it, made the hair on the back of Jordan's neck stand up. He'd heard it before, in different settings, wrapped in different excuses, but always with the same message. People like you don't belong here. Still, he didn't speak. He looked straight ahead, refusing to shrink or... She boarded the plane with the kind of energy that made you instinctively move out of her way, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, and a walking pace that dared anyone to slow her down. In her late 50s, perhaps early 60s, she wore the kind of outfit that screamed status. A crisp cream-colored jacket that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle, a strand of pearls so large they looked more symbolic than decorative, oversized sunglasses that remained on even inside the aircraft, and an expensive handbag that seemed less for utility and more for making a statement. She paused in the aisle as if offended by the very concept of economy seating, glancing at the passengers around her like she was trying to locate the exit of a place she never meant to walk into. Clutched in her manicured hand was her boarding pass, and after glancing down at it, she started down the row, every step brimming with displeasure. Then she stopped, dead in her tracks. Her eyes landed on Jordan Miles. He had resumed reading, completely unaware that he was about to become the epicenter of a conflict he never asked for. She blinked once, slowly, her posture stiffening as she realized that her assigned middle seat was right next to him. Her expression shifted, not subtly but sharply, like someone who'd just smelled something unpleasant. Her eyebrows lifted, her mouth pressed into a thin line, and then, almost theatrically, she exhaled. She stood frozen in the aisle, making no move to sit down, blocking the line behind her and causing murmurs of mild frustration among passengers still boarding. Jordan, sensing a presence but not yet the tension, looked up from his book. He smiled politely, expecting a simple "excuse me" as she moved into her seat. But what came next was something else entirely. She didn't respond to his nod, didn't acknowledge his smile. Instead, she turned sharply to the nearest flight attendant, who was helping another passenger stow a bag just a few seats away, and said, loudly enough to be heard several rows back, "I'm not sitting next to him. Can you move me, please?" The air changed instantly, not dramatically but noticeably. It was the kind of shift that people feel before they fully understand what's happening. The moment when the atmosphere in a room thickens and conversation softens into discomfort. The flight attendant, a young woman who looked like she hadn't dealt with this kind of confrontation before, froze for a second, caught between professionalism and personal reaction. She straightened, stepped over to the woman, and asked as calmly as she could, "Is there something wrong with your seat, ma'am?" The woman didn't hesitate. She didn't bother to lower her voice either. "I don't feel safe," she said, her tone sharp, condescending, and soaked in self-righteousness. She didn't glance at Jordan again. She didn't need to. Her words had already painted the picture she wanted everyone to see. The insinuation hung in the air like smoke. Passengers in nearby rows began to stir. Some looked over, others glanced, down awkwardly, while a few pulled out their phones. Not yet filming, but preparing, just in case. Jordan blinked slowly, his eyes meeting the flight attendant's with a quiet question written across his face. Is this really happening? He didn't say anything. He didn't defend himself or protest. He didn't even shift in his seat. Instead, he simply closed his book, a smooth, slow movement that somehow made the silence around him louder. He rested it in his lap and waited. Not passively, not fearfully, but with the practiced calm of someone who had spent years learning when to speak and when to watch. The flight attendant looked at him, then back at the woman, and tried again. "Ma'am, I understand you're uncomfortable, but this is the seat you were assigned. We're nearly full. There aren't many options to switch at the moment." The woman scoffed, now visibly annoyed that her request hadn't been immediately granted. "Well, someone needs to move. I shouldn't have to sit here. This is unacceptable." Her voice, while not yelling, carried enough arrogance to travel clearly over the cabin noise. Her posture remained stiff, standing tall as though her disapproval alone should change the circumstances. The people around them were no longer just noticing, they were watching. Some with disbelief, some with discomfort, and a few with quiet outrage building behind their eyes. A man 2 rows back lowered his tray table, clearly listening. A woman across the aisle paused mid-sentence in her conversation. The tension wasn't just between the woman and Jordan anymore. It was starting to ripple outward, infecting the whole section with unease. Jordan, still silent, allowed the moment to stretch, not because he didn't care, but because he did. Because he knew that rushing to speak, to defend himself, to push back, might only feed into the ugly assumptions being made about him in real time. He'd lived this before. Not this exact version, not on a plane with a pearl-wearing stranger, but the same ugly sentiment dressed in different clothes. He recognized it instantly. The quiet accusation, the carefully coded fear, the belief that someone like him didn't just make people uncomfortable, but unsafe by simply existing in a space they felt they owned. He breathed in slowly, letting the air fill his chest. He wasn't angry, not yet, just tired. Tired of having to carry dignity on his shoulders like armor. The flight attendant tried again, her voice slightly more tense now. "Ma'am, we can look into reseating options after everyone's boarded, but I need you to take your seat for now so we can continue boarding." The woman didn't move. She shifted her weight, sighed dramatically, and muttered, "Unbelievable," under her breath. But she stayed where she was, arms crossed, waiting, as if daring someone to challenge her further. Jordan watched her calmly. He didn't speak, not because he lacked the words, but because he was waiting for the world to catch up with what was happening in plain sight. He had closed his book, yes, but not his patience, not his strength. He wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Not like this. Not because someone else decided he was the problem. And the silence around him, heavy and sharp, was starting to speak louder than anything he could have said. The flight attendant, now visibly flustered, was doing her best to maintain professionalism while walking a tightrope of politeness and protocol, all under the glaring judgment of dozens of watching eyes. She leaned toward the woman with that careful, almost pleading tone flight crews use when trying to pacify difficult passengers without causing a full-blown scene. "Ma'am," she said, "I understand your concern, and I'll do my best to accommodate you, but this flight is nearly full. We don't have many open seats, especially not in your fare class." She gestured toward the rear of the plane, hinting at the only slim possibility, perhaps a middle seat near the lavatory. But the woman didn't care about logistics. She didn't care about fairness or facts. What she wanted, what she demanded, was to be validated in her bias. "That's not acceptable," she snapped, ignoring the suggestion. "He's probably one of those types." Her voice cut through the cabin like a sudden clap of thunder, silencing even the nearby flight attendant speaking to another passenger. "Always causing problems. You've seen the news." Her voice was rising now, not yelling, but unmistakably calculated to be heard. "I paid good money for this seat, and I'm not going to be crammed next to someone like him." That last sentence hit the air like a spark landing on dry leaves. Gasps, whispers, a few quiet curses slipped out in disbelief. You could feel the collective temperature in the cabin shift, rising from awkward tension to quiet anger. More phones came out, passengers discreetly, or not so discreetly, beginning to record what was clearly turning into something bigger than a seating complaint. A woman across the aisle leaned forward, her brows furrowed in disbelief. A teenage boy 2 rows back whispered to his mom, "Why is she talking like that?" Some people looked to the crew, others to each other, all waiting to see if someone, anyone, was going to step in and say what needed to be said. But Jordan didn't move. He sat still, eyes ahead, his expression unreadable. There was no shouting from him, no angry rebuttal, no defensiveness. He didn't look at the woman, didn't flinch at her words. He just sat there with the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders like it had 100 times before. And maybe that was the most heartbreaking part. His silence wasn't fear. It was familiarity. He knew this script. Different city, different faces, same performance. The kind where someone else's discomfort was treated like an emergency, while his humanity was an afterthought. The flight attendant, now clearly rattled, stepped away briefly to speak with another crew member. Moments later, a quiet buzz rippled through the first few rows as the cabin door opened, and a uniformed pilot stepped into the aisle. Tall, mid-40s, professional but firm in demeanor, he walked forward with the deliberate posture of someone used to taking command in moments of uncertainty. He surveyed the scene quickly, noting the passengers watching, the phones recording, the tension you could practically taste. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked calmly, though his eyes flicked from the woman to Jordan with a flicker of knowing. The woman wasted no time. She turned to the pilot, her voice now oozing false innocence, painting herself as the aggrieved party. "Captain," she said, her tone suddenly gentler, as if the presence of a man in uniform required a performance shift. "I just want to feel comfortable on my flight. I paid for this seat, and I have a right to feel safe. This man," she gestured vaguely at Jordan, "he's making me very uncomfortable." The pilot listened patiently, face unreadable. Then after a pause, he turned to Jordan, who still hadn't spoken. "Sir," the pilot said respectfully, "are you okay?" Jordan looked up, eyes calm but direct. "I'm perfectly fine, sir," he said with quiet dignity. Then, in a move that caused a ripple through the cabin, he slowly stood up. He didn't do it aggressively. There was no anger in the motion, no hostility, just a quiet, deliberate rise, like someone finally deciding it was time to reclaim the air stolen from the room. Passengers leaned forward, phones tilted slightly higher. Everyone braced for some kind of confrontation. Some expected a powerful retort, others anticipated a quiet walk-off. But what Jordan said next left the entire plane speechless. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't insult the woman. He didn't defend himself or explain why he deserved to be there. Instead, he took a slow breath, looked out at the sea of faces, white, black, young, old, silent and recording, and said, "It's not her I'm worried about. It's how many people like her are allowed to think this is normal." The cabin froze. The words didn't need volume. They didn't need flash. They landed with a weight far heavier than any insult or outburst could have. Jordan wasn't just talking to the woman now. He was talking to everyone. Everyone who had ever seen something like this and stayed quiet. Everyone who had ever justified this kind of behavior as discomfort or misunderstanding. Everyone who had let it slide because it wasn't happening to them. The woman blinked, her mouth slightly open, clearly caught off guard. For the first time, she seemed unsure. The pilot didn't respond immediately. He looked at Jordan for a long moment, then nodded once, almost as if to say he understood more than his role allowed him to admit aloud. A low murmur moved through the cabin, one of agreement, of shame, of realization. The tension had shifted again, but this time not toward anger. This time it was reflection, and while no one spoke up to cheer, no one needed to. Jordan's words had done the one thing the woman's accusations couldn't. They united the passengers not in outrage, but in awareness. The moment had changed, and so had the tone of the entire flight. Jordan stood with a stillness that wasn't empty. It was full. Full of years he hadn't talked about. Full of long walks home after being called names. Full of the times he was told he was well-spoken, as if that were a surprise. Full of moments just like this one, in airports and coffee shops, in boardrooms and break rooms, where someone else's discomfort demanded he apologize for his existence. But he didn't shake. He didn't lower his eyes. Instead, with calm clarity, he said, "I work with children every day, kids who get bullied, excluded, and made to feel less because of how they look. And I always tell them one thing: your worth doesn't change because someone else refuses to see it." The words didn't echo through the plane like a roar. They settled like a warm current passing through each seat, each row. He paused, letting the silence breathe, not to make a scene, but to let the weight of truth land without apology. Then, his eyes, soft but unyielding, moved slowly across the passengers, making quiet contact with those who had just moments ago been unsure whether to speak or stay silent. "So," he continued, his voice still calm, "I'm not moving. Not because I want to make a scene, but because I've spent my whole life shrinking myself so others could feel tall. Today I'm done with that." And just like that, the mood shifted again. But this time, the stillness wasn't fear or tension. It was respect. The kind that doesn't need to be announced or clapped for. The kind that is earned by grace in the face of disrespect. And as Jordan stood there, not with fists raised but shoulders back, people felt it. The woman whose confidence had moments ago filled the aisle now sat rigid, her eyes darting, lips twitching as if to speak. But she didn't, or couldn't, because now she was the one being watched, and something about that attention, those many eyes not judging her for her jewelry or her accent or her handbag, but for her choices, suddenly made her smaller. Then from 2 rows back, a man rose, not hurriedly, not performatively, but as if his own conscience had finally reached its boiling point. "I'll switch seats with him," he said plainly, looking toward Jordan, not the woman. The statement wasn't dramatic, just steady, like someone tossing a rope across a widening gap of division. Before anyone could respond, a voice from the left side of the plane followed. "No," said a woman, perhaps in her 40s, arms crossed, but eyes kind. "Let him stay. She should move if she has a problem." It wasn't angry. It was protective. Another voice chimed in from the back. "You're the problem, not him." Then another. "Let him be." And another. "You don't speak for us." One by one, like drops into a calm lake, the silence gave way to support, not outrage, not yelling, just a collective refusal to let silence be mistaken for agreement. The passengers weren't staging a protest. They were simply refusing to let wrong sit comfortably. And in that refusal, they gave Jordan something far more powerful than pity. They gave him backup. Real, human, uncoached support. The pilot, who had been watching quietly, finally stepped forward again, now understanding that the temperature of the room had changed. His authority wasn't needed to restore order. It was needed to reflect what the cabin had already decided. He turned to the woman, and with a voice that had likely navigated dozens of in-flight crises, said calmly, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step off the plane." No dramatics, no arguing, just a simple, clear conclusion to an unnecessary storm. For a moment, she didn't move. She looked around as if waiting for someone to object, to support her, to affirm that she was right and Jordan was wrong. But no one did. No one would. She was alone, not because of who she was, but because of who she chose to be in that moment. And without another word, under the quiet watch of dozens of silent passengers and recording phones, she picked up her designer handbag and walked down the aisle, her exit marked not by applause but by relief. A breath returned to the plane that no one realized they had been holding. Jordan sat back down, not triumphantly but quietly, with dignity, not victory. The man who had offered to switch nodded at him with quiet respect. The woman across the aisle offered a warm smile. And slowly, as the engines hummed and the cabin door closed, the passengers resumed their journey, not just through the sky, but into a moment they would likely never forget. Because in a world that often chooses comfort over courage, today they had seen both. And it all started with one man refusing to shrink. Jordan sat back down, sliding gently into his seat like someone who had been carrying weight for years and had finally chosen to set it down, not with bitterness, but with peace. His new seatmate, a soft-spoken woman in her 30s wearing a sweatshirt, with the word empathy printed across the chest, turned to him and smiled, a real smile, the kind you don't give to just anyone. She offered him a stick of gum with a small nod that said, without words, "You're not alone." Jordan accepted it, then leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a moment, not to escape the world around him, but to finally breathe in it without holding his breath. The cabin, once thick with tension, had settled into a hush, not the kind born from awkwardness or fear, but the kind that follows an unscripted moment of truth. People didn't know what to say, but their silence was different now. It carried weight, reflection, maybe even admiration. Flight attendants moved quietly through the aisles with drinks and snacks, their voices softer, their glances warmer. The entire flight unfolded, not like a storybook fairy tale, but like real life when people choose better, when they realize they're all flying on the same plane in more ways than one. As the hours passed, Jordan didn't say much. He didn't need to. The moment had said enough. But what he did do was smile back at those who caught his eye. The father with the toddler 2 rows ahead, the college kid with earbuds and an unsure grin, the elderly couple who'd watched it all unfold and were now whispering with the kind of pride reserved for watching someone else's grandchild grow into a person of character. The plane began its descent, the city lights of Atlanta glittering below like 1,000 tiny reasons to keep believing that people could still do the right thing when it mattered. And as the wheels touched down, there was no applause like in the movies. Instead, there was something better, a feeling that everyone had landed not just in a new city, but in a better version of themselves. Passengers stood stretching and retrieving bags, but many of them paused near Jordan's seat. Not out of obligation, not for performance, but because they felt the need to acknowledge something powerful, something rare. "Thank you," whispered a young woman, resting her hand gently on his shoulder for a moment. "You handled that better than I think I ever could have." A man with a briefcase nodded deeply. "That was real strength, brother. Real strength." Even a teenage boy, awkward and shy, gave him a quick fist bump and murmured, "You're cool, man," before darting down the aisle. Jordan accepted each gesture with humility, replying only with soft thank yous and take cares, his tone as steady as it had been throughout the entire ordeal. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't basking in any attention. He was just being who he'd always been, a man who believed that respect wasn't something you had to earn through conflict, but something you carried within you, no matter who tried to take it away. As he stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the crowd slowly dispersed, some off to baggage claim, others toward connecting flights, but many still carrying the echo of what they'd witnessed. And somewhere, far from the glow of gate lights and security announcements, wordless conversations were happening. Between mothers and children, couples and friends, even within the hearts of strangers, about what it meant to stand up, not with fists or fury, but with truth. This wasn't just a story about a rude woman on a plane. That part faded quickly, like static in the background. The real story, the one that would be told again and again in different ways, was about a man who stayed seated when someone told him to move, not out of defiance, but out of self-respect. It was about a voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. It was about how dignity can still ripple louder than hate when we let it. And it reminded everyone watching that sometimes, courage doesn't look like confrontation. It looks like staying calm when you have every right to be angry. It looks like telling the truth not to shame someone else, but to honor yourself. And as Jordan exited the gate, backpack slung over one shoulder just like it had been when he boarded, nothing about him seemed extraordinary at first glance. But, for those who had witnessed the moment unfold, he had become a quiet symbol of something more. Not a celebrity, not a viral clip, but a reminder that everyday people can make extraordinary stands in the most ordinary places. And perhaps in a world that often rewards the loudest voice in the room, it's the calm, honest ones that change hearts. As he walked through the terminal toward the exit, the PA system buzzed faintly with flight information. Passengers came and went with their own stories, and life continued on like it always does. But something had changed, because now, every person on that flight had a new story to carry, a story that started with injustice, passed through courage, and landed softly in hope. A story they'd tell their friends, their families, their kids, or a story that would start with, "You won't believe what I saw on the plane today," and end with the quiet power of a man who didn't fight back, but stood up anyway. And maybe, just maybe, that story would remind them the next time they saw something wrong, that their voice mattered too. Sometimes, the loudest act of courage is quiet. Jordan didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply stood his ground with grace, and in doing so, reminded everyone watching that real strength is calm, real dignity is unshakable, and real change starts with one person choosing not to shrink. In a world that often tells you to stay silent, let this be your reminder. Your worth is not up for debate. Stand tall, not with anger, but with truth. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. We bring you powerful, real-life stories that prove kindness, courage, and character still matter. Hit the bell icon so you never miss one, because sometimes one story can change how we all see the world.